I don't even remember. It was very close to the river, and pretty far north. I mean, so just due west of Burlington, just
Okay.
across the lake. But
Yeah, across Lake
sort of,
Champlain.
sort of like an iconic climb, like big granite. But I have no memory of the name. I'm gonna find out though, because I'm still very good friends with that person.
Awesome. Yeah, I spend a lot of, it's, less than an hour drive north of me. So, I spend quite some time up there.
Sorry, you must have other things to do than chat about the Adirondack.
No, I'm just, opening this in my laptop too. So I like to have it open, or just opening Zoom in my laptop.
Of course.
Here, I'm going to let my other self in. Yeah, oh, I should let you know I'm recording this if it's okay with you.
It's fine by me.
Yeah, and I'll let everyone else know.
Where would you place it? Like on your Facebook page or on YouTube or?
Yeah, so I think probably both. There's someone else that is going to work on, because we have a couple other events, one on like local abolitionist history, another one on the Rojava Revolution that we did in the spring. So it'll be on YouTube and Facebook, and I'll send you some links, once we get it up.
Please. So I don't know anything about you and your sort of connections, but do you know a guy named Anatol Dolgov in New York City? I'm sorry, you're now on mute.
I muted myself. I muted the wrong me. Okay. The other me is, I just finished his book. I saw him speak at the conference, was it a year or two ago at the Yiddish Anarchism.
Right.
He's a trip.
Yes, he's an amazing person. So his parents, right, like are sort of legends, but would have known Yiddish. I don't think Anatol knows Yiddish. He might. I'm not sure if he does or doesn't.
Yeah, I don't know.
I say that as far as I know, he's the last known living person who knew Ben Fletcher.
Oh, really?
I mean, there
that you know of,
else out there, but when he was in the late 40s, his father and Ben were good friends, and they saw each other multiple times, like regularly, and so that's pretty cool. So as far as the connection to Ben Fletcher, Anatol is it.
So you're one. Does that make you 2 degrees of separation from Ben Fletcher?
He forgives us too, right? Exactly. And since you know him also, that's. I knew one other woman who I don't know if she's still alive, who was also a child, but whose father was friends with Fletcher. But I've lost touch with her, and she might not be alive still.
Yeah.
Yeah, but amazing to think about.
That's pretty cool. I'll be right back. I'm going to actually turn this fan off. So
take all the time you need. Or maybe you want to let people in.
Okay, and then just last minute, I have to check email to see if there are any last minute registrations and send them the Zoom link. And there's one. Yeah, it's likely going to be a pretty small crowd tonight.
No need to apologize. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. Yeah, there is a journalist who I don't think knew anything about the Wobblies before this, so she might be here, and even if she's not, that connection was made. I think she's based in DC now. So she's like super excited about this and the story of Ben Fletcher. She might want to talk to you at some point. So I'll be happy to put the two of you in touch.
Thank you.
Cool. All right. Yeah, I see more people coming in, so I'm going to let them in shortly, and then we'll probably also give it a few minutes. Just,
Yeah,
people are late.
I am in no
You,
rush.
you know the drill.
I know it a little, and every situation is different, but I'm not in a rush. I'm just in my dining room.
Yeah. All right. All right. So I wanted to welcome everyone for coming tonight and attending this event. We're really excited about this at the Mohawk Valley Freedom School. I know some of you have been to some of our events before, and I see some new faces here too. So just want to welcome all of you. For those of you who are not yet on our email list, you're more than welcome to reach out to us on Facebook or by email at a very long but easy to remember email address, which is Mohawk Valley Freedom School at gmail.com. And we'd be happy to add your name on that. We do have a couple other events lined up with dates still, to be determined over the next few months. So just, keep your eyes peeled in your inbox and on Facebook and social media for announcements on that. I do want to let folks know we will have, of course, a question and answer session after Peter Cole gives his presentation about Ben Fletcher and about the book he wrote about Ben Fletcher. And I also want to give props to some of the other organizations that co-sponsored the event. There's, of course, the Copper City Collective based in Rome, E Pluribus America, which is an American cultural website and magazine. The Greater New York State branch of the Industrial Workers of the World, and the Other Side in Utica. And last but not least, the Treehouse Reading and Arts Center, which is a locally based bookstore in the Utica area. I will provide links to the Treehouse Reading and Arts Center. The owner did inform me earlier today that she put in an order of Peter Cole's books, so you'll be able to go down to the store, support that local business, and check out some of their other books, and of course, buy one of Peter's books too. So, I want to thank everyone once again for coming. If you want to learn more about the Freedom School, we have more information about our history and everything and our core beliefs on our Facebook page. And we are also looking for more volunteers. So if events like this interest you, then you're more than welcome to get involved and step up and get involved with organizing these events. So I also want to, just let people know, encourage folks to mute their microphones. And now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Peter Cole. So Peter Cole is an acclaimed historian, and he's carefully researched the life of Ben Fletcher, painstakingly uncovering a stunning range of documents related to this extraordinary man. Ben Fletcher, The Life and Times of a Black Wobbly, is the most comprehensive look at Fletcher ever to be published. It includes a detailed biographical sketch of his life and history, reminiscences by fellow workers who knew him, a chronicle of the IWW's impressive decade-long run on the Philadelphia waterfront, in which Fletcher played a pivotal role in nearly all of his known writings and speeches, thus giving Fletcher timeless voice Fletcher's timeless voice another opportunity to inspire a new generation of workers, organizers, and agitators. This revised and expanded second edition includes new materials such as facsimile reprints of 2 extremely rare pamphlets on racism from the early 20th century, more information on his prison years and personal life, additional recollections from friends, greater consideration of Fletcher from a global perspective, and much more. Peter Cole, a professor of history at Western Illinois University and research associate in the Society Work and Development Program at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa, he's the author of Wobblies on the Waterfront, Interracial Unionism in Progressive Era Philadelphia, and the award-winning Dock Worker Power, Race, and Activism in Durban and the San Francisco Bay Area. He also is the founder and co-director of the Chicago Race Riot of 1919 Commemoration Project. So a bunch of great projects and books to check out. Finally, PM Press is the publisher of this book. So check out their website. I'll provide a link. And again, check out the Treehouse Reading and Arts Center to buy that book locally if you live in the Utica area. So without further ado, take it away, Peter.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for choosing to spend some of your evening with me instead of doing things like, I don't know what anyone goes out anymore during COVID, but like, you know, I'm thrilled to be here with you. I actually just gave a talk this morning to people in Johannesburg, to friends of mine in Johannesburg, because I have those connections. It's a tough word to pronounce, Witwatersrand, right? It's Afrikaans, which is sort of Old Dutch, but the W's are V's in Afrikaans. No offense taken, of course. I'm talking to you from Macomb, Illinois, yeah, which is halfway between St. Louis and Chicago. And I am going to, instead of letting you stare at me, which is no fun, I'm going to share my screen and show you our PowerPoint and speak for maybe about 30 plus minutes. And then afterwards, be happy to sort of stick around to talk with anyone who has comments or questions. All right, so. Hopefully that all works. Someone will tell me if it doesn't. So, Ben Fletcher. I call him the greatest Black revolutionary you've never heard of, because, well, the truth of the matter is that very few people are aware of his existence or the role he played in a union in the city of Philadelphia that in the 19-teens and 1920s was arguably the most powerful, effective interracial union into the history of America up until that point. And that Fletcher, as the leader of that union, really is, I'm suggesting, one of the most important Black labor figures in US history, even though very few people know about him. I also am going to suggest to you that his history, the history of the union he was a part of, are indeed very relevant to our own times. Sorry about that. There we go. So Ben Fletcher, this is actually the most amazing, but also sort of powerful photograph. This is a picture of Ben Fletcher when he was being processed for entry into Leavenworth Prison, a subject I'll talk about later in today's talk. So Ben Fletcher, I've already said, was African-American who led a multi-ethnic, multiracial union in the city of Philadelphia. Nowadays, in 2021, a lot of us are thinking about this concept called racial capitalism. And I'm happy to talk about that too. But 100 years ago, were even more intense in terms of white supremacy, in terms of xenophobia in the United States specifically, and extreme inequality on a scale that can be hard to imagine. And so I'm going to be talking to you about some of these matters, hopefully of great interest. Now, Ben Fletcher was born in the city of Philadelphia, which was the third biggest city in the United States at that time. And Philadelphia also happened to be the largest Black community outside of the South in the late 19th and early 20th century. His parents originally had moved to Philadelphia separately, I believe, from Virginia a few years prior in the 1880s, which is the decade after the end of Reconstruction. It's actually technically before the rise of Jim Crow, but already in the 1880s, there's growing concern among African Americans, 90% who lived in the South, of racial troubles, including mass violence. And so there's a steady stream of Black people who move out of the South, although it will sort of become a flowing river during World War I. Fletcher's parents and really his background are really unknown, unfortunately. I surmise that Fletcher's parents were both born into slavery because they were both born before the Civil War and in Virginia. And so most Black people in Virginia were enslaved in the 1850s, but honestly, we don't know. And Fletcher, Ben Fletcher, that is, never talked about that. I, not that long ago, actually discovered his father was from the eastern shore of Virginia, sorry, and that's a maritime region. And so it's quite possible, actually, that Fletcher's father worked on ships or on waterfronts or on boats. And that's something interesting to think about. And there's actually a very long history of Black maritime workers in the United States and really throughout the Atlantic world. When Fletcher's parents moved to Philadelphia in the 1880s and then lived there through the 1890s and into the 20th century, another prominent Black person also lived in Philadelphia, far more well-known, named W.E.B. Du Bois. His first book actually was about Philadelphia, called The Philadelphia Negro, published in 1899, I believe. And in that book, he describes essentially the Black experience in Philadelphia in the 1890s, in which he said that the number one factor that determines the success or the opportunities of Black men and Black women was racism. I'm also highlighting here that union membership was much lower in Philadelphia than a number of other industrial cities. And so what you've got here in Philadelphia is a place where racism is the norm, but also where it's very hard to organize a union, even though it was a major industrial city. Around 1910, which would make Ben Fletcher 20 years old, he joined the Industrial Workers of the World. I'm going to talk much more about them in a minute, and the Socialist Party, which at that time was quite common for people to sort of do. And although he didn't have steady work, he worked as a day laborer, including sometimes as a longshoreman. So where you could find work on a sort of basically by the day. We do know that in the early 19 teens, he's already sort of being featured in IWW newspapers as being an important organizer and considered to be a really great speaker. Back in the day, as in 100 years ago, soapbox speakers, because, well, Fletcher was actually short, but also it was common for speakers to basically carry around a small box that they could stand on so that they could be above the crowd, literally, so that people could hear them. In the 19 teens, this is before radio, before television, before the internet. And so print media is the only form of mass communication, but it was quite common for organizers, both union organizers, but also religious organizations like the Salvation Army to actually speak to people on the streets in working class neighborhoods. And I surmise, although I could be totally wrong, that it might have been Ben Fletcher's introduction to the IWW was listening to another wobbly speaker on a street corner in his neighborhood in South Philly. However, he managed to join the IWW in around 1910. The IWW was a new organization that was growing very rapidly in the late first in the aughts and then in the 19 teens. It was founded in the city of Chicago in 1905, then the greatest industrial city in the country. And it was established by a group of several hundred radicals, unionists, socialists, anarchists, and the like, who basically believed that the status quo was unacceptable. It's a time of extreme economic inequality, where corporations totally dominate the economy, where literally there are zero government regulations to sort of rein in the sort of power of corporations and employers, and where a small group of hyper-rich people really control the economy with almost no oversight from the government. And the government would regularly dispatch police and soldiers to sort of defeat unions, as they had repeatedly in the late 19th century. The working class was very weak. Very few people were in unions. And those who were in unions generally belonged to the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. And in the AFL, that union actually refused to organize women generally African Americans generally, immigrants generally, and so-called unskilled workers, which is to say that the IWW was created because the AFL chose to not organize most working class people. In addition to that, the AFLs didn't have a political agenda. They really just wanted to earn more money for their members and get better conditions and hours. I support workers making more money too and working fewer hours. However, the IWW from its inception was committed to socialism, to the idea that capitalism was inherently unfair and would never be reformed. And so those who founded the industrial workers of the world were very clearly socialists. And they believed that unionism, as opposed to, say, a political party, was the best path towards achieving socialism. They also believed that capitalism was a global problem, and so therefore the solution had to be global as well. And so that's why these people who founded the IWW in 1905 took the name Industrial Workers of the World, as opposed to, say, the Industrial Workers of America. As I already noted, the IWW was a socialist organization, or we might also call it anti-capitalist, and that's because of the extreme inequality that existed in the country, the extreme inequality. And so this poster from 1911 is real classic and much reproduced, and it might seem quite familiar to people, or I could say that people in the 21st century might relate to it quite well. In addition, I also want to highlight that the IWW's motto, which was adopted very early on, an injury to one is an injury to all, is really sort of the single sentence that encapsulates the IWW vision very clearly, which is to say that we are one, we are workers, and we are going to defend each other and represent each other in opposition to our employers. And so it's a very clear class-conscious, class struggle institution. Now, the IWW also was, because of that, anti-racist from their birth. So in their founding convention, they commit themselves to organizing all people regardless of race or sex or nationality, period, right? There were Black people and women at the founding convention, as well as immigrants and people from foreign countries. And they would make fun of the American Federation of Labor, for example, for being the American separation of labor. One of many examples of the clever IWW lingo. But I am also highlighting here that in Philadelphia, the dock workers who worked along the river named the Delaware River, but also another river called the Schuylkill River, were a very diverse lot. Approximately 1/3 African-American, approximately 1/3 Irish and Irish Americans, and approximately 1/3 European immigrants from countries like, say, Italy or maybe Poland. And this very diverse workforce made it very hard generally for workers to overcome racism and xenophobia. This is one of the reasons also that the AFL didn't want to organize such workers. By contrast, the IWW would embrace such workers and saying it really doesn't matter what people's race or nationality are, it matters that they're workers, and therefore we are one together. Now, I do also want to highlight the industry that Local 8 and Ben Fletcher were a part of, and that's the maritime or shipping industry. You might also call it marine transport. Nowadays, we call this sometimes logistics or even just transportation, but specifically the ship. This is before, of course, big trucks, but railroads had been invented in the 1800s. Shipping was the first global industry. It was literally the reason that European empires conquered the world and dominated it for 500 years. It also simultaneously was integral to the spread of capitalism from Western Europe and the UK to other places, right? And so we think of the ship, right, sort of instrumental to the rise of European empire, but also to capitalism. And we also think of the ship in terms of working class resistance to these, to capitalism. In London, England, in the 1760s, sailors who wanted to raise, London then being the greatest port in the world, took down the sails of their ship. They stopped work in order to try to push their captain, their employer, to give them a raise. Now, the nautical term for taking down the sails of a ship is to strike the sails. As a result of that event, that becomes the de facto word in the English language for all work stoppages. But it also tells us, sort of subtly, the instrumental role of maritime, of shipping to capitalism, right? But the word that we used for work stoppages is in fact a maritime term, is not insignificant. Now, as for the work of dockers or dock workers or people who work along the shore, who become nicknamed longshoremen, although I generally use the term dock workers, right? Like, so this was an all-male workforce. It was, in many ports across the world, considered to be the sort of work that men only would do, although nowadays there are women who work in this field. You know, the work was very dangerous. It was very hard. You might lift hundreds of pounds, sometimes with a partner, sometimes by yourself, up and down ships in day and night. The ships, of course, are moving because they're not stable in good weather and bad, right? And you might work for 12 hours, 18 hours, 24 hours. Why? Because the ship must sail on time, right? And so dock workers, if you got a job, the job was very, very hard, right? Like there's also, you were hired by the job, meaning that you got hired, say today, maybe you finish loading that ship tomorrow with your another 100 guys in different gangs. You may not have another job. You might have a job the next day, but you might not have another job for a week or a month, right? There was no guarantee, especially because there was very large labor surpluses in American cities as rural Americans, white and black, were moving to cities, like Fletcher's parents, but also as immigrants, especially at that time from Europe, were moving to America, so that industrial cities generally had these huge labor surpluses that both benefited employers, but also drove down wages and divided workers. This was also, I should say, sort of encouraged, you might say, by employers through the hiring process itself, which was nicknamed the Shape Up, so that hundreds or sometimes thousands of workers might show up on the waterfront in the morning to get hired. So if there's 100 people looking for work, but only 20 jobs, who gets those jobs? Well, the boss picks. The boss might pick based on same race, same religion, same neighborhood, maybe because you've given a bribe, etc. But the effect of labor surplus on this scale is that wages get driven down and workers see each other as the enemy, right? They are divided and therefore they are weak. However, once workers do get hired, I'm emphasizing here that the nature of the work is collective. And so I'm a teacher, right? And here I am, a historian talking to you. I prepared this lecture by myself, right? I work very individually and independently. That might be good, but it doesn't mean necessarily that I have a collective identity, although I actually do very much identify with my fellow teachers. By contrast, dock workers work together. They work together in pairs, they work together in gangs, and they work together in multiple gangs in order to load or unload a ship. And in addition to that, it is very, very rare, to put it mildly, that the dock worker elevates himself to become a ship captain, right? And as a result of this, there's a very clear class divide between us and them, between workers and bosses, but also a very clear collective consciousness. I'm highlighting these because it is not insignificant that this industry foments a disproportionate number of workers' collective action, both as strikes, but also as unions. And in the spring of 1913, 4,000 dock workers, pretty much the whole workforce in Philadelphia at that time, went on strike. Ben Fletcher was already a member of the IWW. He and other Wobblies basically encouraged this strike, but also during the strike charter, the strikers in the IWW as Local 8 of the Marine Transport Workers. And after 2 weeks on strike, they win a raise, but they also win union recognition. And they also, from that point forward, for the next 10 years approximately, dominate the waterfront. Once in power, Ben Fletcher, along with other leaders in Local 8, quickly institute significant changes. I'm highlighting here racial integration. So it was employers who created segregation. Let me repeat that. It was employers who created segregation, right? Now, that doesn't mean all workers were anti-racist, far from it. But once this union gained power, they started to institute integrated work gangs, where previously employers had black gangs, Irish gangs, Polish gangs, etc. Now the unions demanded and basically just snapped its fingers and started to integrate the gangs, as well as its own union events and union leadership through mandate, right? And so it immediately, I highlighted previously that the IWW was anti-racist in principle, and now I'm demonstrating that in practice, the IWW, where it had the power to do so, instituted anti-racist practices, right? They also changed a number of other things on the waterfront. Rather than having to show up early in the morning, maybe in crap weather, on the hopes that you might get a job, instead, employers will have to call up the union hall in Philadelphia and say, employer wants 100 men to sort of work at Pier 28 to unload coffee beans, right? The union decides who those people are. The shape up is abolished, right? No more casual hiring system. Instead, the union will dispatch. The union will dispatch equitably. You'll have to maintain your dues, your monthly payment. You'll get a button like the ones you see here as examples. The dues are very low, but nevertheless, they want to make sure that everyone's in the union, right? Like they also start to sort of demonstrate the power of work stoppages, right? And so they declare on their first birthday a strike to celebrate their inaugural strike a year prior. Employers don't like this. They threaten to sort of basically fire everyone, but in the afternoon of that celebration day, they're actually asking for people to come to work that night because they don't want to lose a full day, right? And so these are examples of essentially the union having power in order to institute changes that employers don't want. Let me also highlight here that the IWW is doing this without signing a legal contract. Because the IWW believed that the most important power of workers is to strike, they didn't want to sacrifice that power by signing away the ability to strike. Because as you may know, most union contracts have a quote, no strike clause in them, right? Instead, they had oral agreements. Right? Now, the effect of this is that if employers have the power to actually undermine the union, pay workers less, work them harder, et cetera, they can do that. If the only way to combat employer desires is through repeated examples of worker power on the job, which the IWW refers to as direct action, right? In other words, the strike and the threat of a strike. And so this is basically class struggle on the job. Right? And for the next 9 years, this will be essentially how the Philadelphia waterfront operates. I do want to highlight, if only for this one slide, that what's happening in Philadelphia is happening in many other American and foreign places. In fact, it was sailors who were part of the IWW who brought the ideas of the IWW to every continent where humans lived and to dozens of countries around the world in the 19-teens and 1920s, including the Little Red Songbook in Finnish on the left. And I love this image of a New Zealand miners' hall on the right. The two people standing there give us a sense of the size of the building, but also, I mean, just sort of the images of the workers' wealth, the world's workers, right, in this miners' hall. I also want to highlight here that the IWW in New Zealand was the first union of white people to organize indigenous people who are called Maori, right? And so just as in the United States, the IWW was anti-racist, it so was in New Zealand. And this morning when I spoke to people in South Africa, the IWW also brought itself to South Africa, where it was the first union to organize the Black majority there. Now, as Philadelphia was the dominant sort of really union of dock workers, Fletcher was dispatched regularly to try to sort of spread IWW power to other ports up and down the East Coast, to Baltimore, to Boston, to Norfolk, to Providence, to New York City, et cetera. And so Fletcher was a much in demand speaker. One time in early 1917, when organizing in Norfolk, Virginia, image on the left is the Norfolk waterfront. The image on the right is not Ben Fletcher, but a Black dock worker from from Norfolk. Fletcher was threatened with a lynching, as well as, by a mob of people on the waterfront, according to reports. And so he actually was smuggled out of Norfolk at night by friends and sailed to Boston in order to escape the potential of a lynch mob. Now, it's hard to know really what happened there because all we have is this one report from Fletcher, but it is worth noting that in 1917, approximately 100 Black men were murdered or lynched across the United States. That averages out to about 2 a week, right? And so Fletcher very likely escaped dearly with his life. Unfortunately for Fletcher and the IWW, World War I commenced in 1917. That is, the United States declared war in 1917. The war had actually begun in 1914. And the government, the federal government, used the war as an excuse to basically attack the IWW. The US Congress will pass a series of laws called the Espionage and Sedition Acts. And then we'll start to spy on the IWW in the summer of 1917. Fletcher at that time is in Boston. And we know this because I have records of federal agents spying on Ben Fletcher in June of 1917, right? And so what we've got here is the IWW being basically attacked by the federal government in order to destroy what was the most powerful left-wing union in the United States, using the war as an excuse. And so Fletcher was arrested in 1918 and was part of this mass trial in Chicago that took in the spring and summer of 1918 into the fall of 1918. When Fletcher was on this trial, or in this trial in Chicago, staying in Cook County Jail, which is notorious, that was also where the Haymarket martyrs were executed and kept before that. Fletcher made several jokes that became sort of famous in IWW circles. During the trial, he turned to his friend Big Bill Haywood, the most famous Wobbly, and said, if it wasn't for me, there wouldn't be any color at all in this trial. Ha ha. As the sentences were being read out at the end of the trial, a 4-month trial, the longest trial in the history of the US up until that point, the jury came back in under 30 minutes, all people guilty on all counts, which is to say the jury actually didn't consider at all the individuals. They just basically said everyone's guilty. As the sentences were being read, Fletcher again turned to his friend Haywood and said, the judge isn't using very good grammar this morning. And Haywood said, how's that, Ben? And Fletcher replied, it's because his sentences are far too long. Fletcher received a 10-year prison sentence and $30,000 fine. If you adjust for inflation, that's more like $300,000 today. And all the Wobblies who were part of that federal trial got 10 to 20 years, $10,000 to $30,000 fines, et cetera, and were sent to federal pen in Leavenworth. Sorry. Picture on the left is Leavenworth Federal Prison in Kansas, the first federal penitentiary. It was nicknamed by some people the University of Radicalism because there were so many radicals who were thrown into prison in Leavenworth in 1918, 1919. Wobblies, communists, anarchists, religious objectors, black soldiers who had been found guilty of treason, Mexican revolutionaries like Ricardo Flores Magón. Although we don't have any evidence of what Fletcher thought about prison, which is unfortunate. We do have words from Magón, Ricardo Flores Magón, who was a revolutionary Mexican anarchist who lived for much of the 19-teens in the US. According to Magón, describing prison time, he described Leavenworth as being caught by the formidable mechanism of a monstrous machine. My flesh gets ripped open, my bones crush, my moans fill the space and make the very infinite shudder, but the machine will not stop grinding, grinding, grinding. We also know, thanks to federal surveillance of all political prisoners, who Fletcher was writing to, who was writing to Fletcher, and even in some cases, some of the letters that actually Fletcher received or wrote. Most of the book that I wrote, or I should say edited, really, are primary sources, which is to say that the first 80 pages of the book is a lengthy introduction by me, but there's about 200 pages in the book in which I collect almost every document that Fletcher ever created, i.e. everything he wrote for a newspaper or correspondence, or anything that was written about Fletcher, right? But one example of a letter in my book, which I'll quote from here, is a letter that Fletcher wrote on New Year's Eve, 1920, so in the very final day of 1919, which was a revolutionary year around the world. The Soviet Union had been birthed. There's Irish Revolution, there's Hungarian Revolution, there's attempted German Revolution, there's a Mexican Revolution. As Ben Fletcher writes to a socialist friend in Milwaukee that evening, we are living in momentous times. None of us are gifted with the power of clairvoyancy as to be able to foretell the day or the hour. Therefore, the first and most important duty is for all of us to prepare ourselves for the final chapter in the life of capitalism. Written from after spending a year in federal prison. Now, Fletcher was in prison, but Local 8 soldiered on, even though its top 6 leaders, not just Fletcher, but 5 others were arrested and imprisoned. Local 8 actually continued to hold on to power during and after World War I, and even the US Navy Yard only hired Local 8 members, despite the fact that Local 8's leaders were serving time in federal prison. They pull off a major strike in 1920 for the 8-hour day that fails, but they hold on to their union. Several years later, Local 8 members are locked out by their employers, who receive a lot of support from the city and federal governments, who basically subsidize strikebreakers. A rival union of the AFL also wants the IWW to disappear. Rising racism, rising xenophobia across the country in the early 1920s makes it that much harder for the union to keep its members together. And so despite this call for solidarity, ultimately Local 8 will fail to hold on to power and will be essentially by 1923 no longer really represent the majority of dock workers in Philadelphia. Throughout the 1920s, it's really an uncertain time in Philadelphia on the waterfront. The rival AFL union will actually reorganize dock workers, including many former Wobblies in 1927. They will finally get the 8-hour day in a union, but the shape-up will return, segregated gangs will return, which is to say basically both employers and the union allow the shape-up and segregated gangs. Right. And waterfront neighborhoods are reportedly more dangerous for Black people to sort of spend time in. And so racism rises. As this amazing poster from sometime in the 1920s that the IWW created demonstrates, the IWW remained very anti-racist and in multiple places across the United States squared off literally and figuratively with the Klan. Ben Fletcher will move to New York City around 1930-31. He'll actually give this incredible interview with the Black newspaper in New York City called the Amsterdam News in 1931, which is also in my book. A few years later, he will suffer a terrible stroke. He's only in his mid-40s, and so he's very young when he has his first stroke. He still was a speaker and an organizer in the early and mid-30s, but that stroke probably ends his professional organizing and really actually makes it very hard for him to hold a job. He had remarried somewhere along the way, and it's very likely that his wife, Clara, was the primary breadwinner for him for many years. Right? It's not clear where they lived entirely, but they probably lived most of their time together. Maybe Fletcher's for 17 or 18 years in Brooklyn in a neighborhood called Bedford-Stuyvesant or Bed-Stuy. And although that neighborhood is well known now, I do want to highlight that before World War II, that neighborhood was not all Black, even though it will, after World War II, become more and more predominantly Black. He'll die in 1949 after years of poor health and will be buried in Brooklyn in an unmarked grave, which is sort of further proof of his poverty. But there's actually a group of people who I've helped to sort of organize, and we are in the process of creating a marker that will be put in that cemetery that we hope later this year to sort of come to fruition, and maybe also put a bench in the neighborhood where he lived so that we can create several places to honor Ben Fletcher moving forward. Ben Fletcher dies in 1949. Although he died a pauper, which is why he's in an unmarked grave, obituaries written about him in multiple papers, including the New York Times, as well as multiple Black newspapers, including his hometown newspaper, the Philadelphia Tribune. Fletcher can remain committed to the IWW specifically and to revolutionary socialism generally until his dying days. He never gave up on his hopes. You didn't have to tell Ben Fletcher, a Black man, that racism was very real, but he wasn't simply trying to sort of end racism. He very much sort of really positioned the core problem, in his opinion, for all working class people as capitalism itself, which is why he remained a steadfast Wobbly until his deathbed. I thank all of you for your attention, assuming you are still paying attention, and very much appreciate the Mohawk Valley Freedom School for inviting me, and I'm happy to sort of talk with y'all, talk about its relevance, talk about any other things you may have questions about now. Yeah, thank you so much.
All right, yeah, and thank you so much, Peter. So if everyone will see, just for a moment, I asked everyone to unmute. I was hoping now we could give a little round of applause for Peter before we get into Q&A, so have at it. Oh, cool.
Nice
So
attempt.
I'm going to thank you, everyone. So I'm going to folks could mute themselves, and we'll open it now to Q&A. So if anyone has a question, I think the group's small enough you could just shout it out. If you would rather to do that, or if you'd rather do that by sending a message to me directly, I could read it out loud to the whole group, and you can also post it in the whole group chat, and I'll keep tabs for that. I know not everyone opened their or unmuted themselves at the same time, so we'll have a round two of that before we all part ways tonight. So yeah, does anyone have a question? There's one right now I'm going to read out loud. So the question is, I want to ask about your potential future marker for Ben Fletcher. Where specifically would that be? And do you have a location? And also for, the Philly waterfront too. Oh, you're muted, Peter. Oh.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that question. So this is sort of a multi-part process, and it's actually part of my ever-growing interest in sort of public history and public art as a way to sort of reach people literally in public space, right? So, for years, actually, people asked me about Ben Fletcher, where was he buried? And I knew, based on the evidence, where he was buried. I never chose to investigate. So he's buried in Brooklyn, right, in the cemetery, Evergreens Cemetery. And unfortunately, as in many places, many cemeteries, there's a section that's just open field where poor people were buried, right? And so we know the cemetery, we know the section of the cemetery, and we've been talking with or in communication with the cemetery to figure out where we can place a marker, say sort of a granite marker near the entrance. And we've been lobbying actually for a large marker because we believe he deserves a lot. Unfortunately, this cemetery has a policy that in this section, you can only have a 1 foot by 1 foot marker, even though, of course, in other sections, people who actually paid money to be buried, right? They get bigger monuments, right? And so that sort of stinks, right? And so then we're trying to figure out, can we also get a memorial bench either in the cemetery or we know where he lived also. So I was just looking at Google Maps earlier to go, where in Brooklyn might we, pay New York City Parks Department, right, to sort of put a bench. And so that's going on in New York City. That's phase 1. Phase 2, Philadelphia, that's in the future. I have friends in Philadelphia, and if you do, please notify me through and connect. But what we might do in Philadelphia very much remains to be determined, right? I actually would love a mural, maybe on a building in South Philadelphia near the waterfront. However, I-95 basically wiped out much of the old waterfront neighborhood along the river, if you've ever driven I-95 through Philadelphia. And so, there's also a maritime museum in Philadelphia on the riverfront. And I know some people there. And so maybe the Independent Seaport Museum might host outside of its building on its property, some sort of marker or whatnot. Once we finish the New York stuff, which I hope will be maybe in the fall of 2021, right? Then we'll move forward on Philly, right? The more money we have, the more we might create, and we will start crowdfunding actually next month. Although we don't yet know how much we're going to ask for, right? Because we're trying to figure that out before we put out a number, right? So for the marker in the cemetery, for maybe a bench and maybe more, although the Philly stuff might be part 2, like I said, at a future. So we're definitely going to start on this New York stuff now, right? And there is a New York City branch of the IWW that's essentially the official sponsor of this, and it'll be under their auspices, right? Even though I was the sort of convener, right? That this is moving forward. New York Wobblies are very happy to honor one of their own in this sort of way. Yeah, so that's the long answer.
Thank you. Yeah, and there's a comment posted in the chat, also from Elizabeth. Don't forget to share your funding links with the Freedom School, and Peter, we'd be happy to share that within our networks too. And I also want to ask if you could tell us, is someone that used to live in that neighborhood, just specifically where he lived in Bed-Stuy, if you have that on hand.
So he, like many people, moved around. So I think I have about 3 addresses, but the last address I believe was 813 Hancock Street. I was just looking it up. I would never remember that otherwise, right? But just earlier today, I was checking it out. I believe in the book, not to sort of say that you have to get the book, right? Like, but I believe in the book I specify a few times residences. So it was a brownstone, probably didn't own it, right? But they might have been the superintendents. It's not uncommon for sort of have a live-in super, if you will, right? Like, and so it's very possible that Ben played that role in that building. His wife might have been a nurse, but I believe 813 Hancock Street, and I believe the park I just named was called Saratoga Park, is the one I was eyeballing as a possible location if the New York City Parks, which does accept donations for benches. And so, yeah, the cemetery's been nice, but to a point, right? Like, I actually wish they sort of were more excited about our desires. It also happens to be a beautiful old cemetery, according to my friends who've been visiting on my behalf, but it's also where some Triangle Fire victims are buried. And there's actually a very large Triangle Fire monument in the same cemetery. But unfortunately, our marker will not be near that. It would make logical sense to celebrate working class people together, but it's in a different section, and apparently our marker will not be allowed there, right? Like, and so we're following whatever rules that we have to follow in order to sort of do what wasn't done in 1949.
Thanks. Small world. I lived on the same street, but it was all the way at the other end. So
That's amazing.
yeah. Cool. Well, who else has a question? Feel free to shout it out. You can raise your hand. Just make sure you unmute yourself. You should have the ability to do that. And before real quick, anyone asks the next question, I'm going to share in the group chat the link to both the local bookstore that I mentioned earlier, as well as PM Press, if you want to buy the book. So yeah, who's up next?
Yeah, Dr. Cole, one great presentation. You mentioned how Ben Fletcher occupied the same sphere as Big Bill Hayward. So I'm kind of wondering if you might have a working thesis on why Ben Fletcher's story has been forgotten while other similar caliber Wobblies have had their story told.
That's a good question, Riley. Riley's a student of mine, as far as I know, the only one who's attended the talk of mine. So thanks for being here. Those are the sorts of questions that really can't have a definitive answer, like, so we can guess, and your guess may in fact be as good as mine, right? Like, but, well, first and all, he was Black, right? Like, and although there were other Wobblies who are celebrated, none of them are Black. Not that the Wobblies would have sort of embraced that racism necessarily, but the society that we live in, right? So that might be one reason. Another reason is that although he was a leader, and he was very well known in the IWW circles, including, like, there's many newspaper articles about him in IWW papers across 20 years, right? Like, he wasn't a national leader the way that Haywood was, or Fletcher sort of was friends with people like Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, was friends with maybe sort of Jack Reed, right? But he also didn't seem to travel as much. I note that he traveled up and down the East Coast, but he didn't travel nationally, or to my knowledge, internationally, with the exception of one trip to Canada in the 1920s, right? At least that I know. And so that might be part of it. But the truth of the matter is that, yeah, there's a handful of Wobblies who are famous, but it's not like there's many of them who are famous either, right? Like, and so, but your question's a good one, and my answer is a weak one because I don't have a good answer, right? But I don't know if there really is a good answer. Why are things forgotten, right? Like, sometimes it's intentional, but generally it's sort of, I do think that race plays a role in that, but I don't know if that's the only factor. I mean, but he's a working class man. He didn't keep a lot of records, right? He wasn't a self-promoter the way that some people were. He never wrote a memoir, right? Like, and so that's why I had to piece together really his life through many, many, many different sources over many years. I wish I knew more, Riley. I appreciate the question.
Yeah, thanks. Great question. There's another question in the group chat from Chris Warner. And Chris asks, do you have plans to do more history, more research in history on the IWW? What parts of IWW history do you think need more work?
Me personally, I'm not sure, to be honest. Yeah, like, so I wrote my dissertation on the union that Fletcher was a part of. It was really because of Fletcher. It was while I was in grad school that I was reading a book on the IWW that's famous called We Shall Be All by a man named Melvin Dubofsky, who taught for many years at SUNY Binghamton, right? Like, and so, you know, in that book, it mentions Fletcher, but only for a few sentences, and notes he's the only African-American leader. And that was what drew me to my dissertation topic that became my first book, called Wobblies on the Waterfront. And then I created this biography sort of Fletcher as a sort of second side project to that first book. I then moved on to sort of work on other things, including dock workers in the Bay Area and Durban. I wrote a book called Dock Worker Power. But along the way, with some friends who are also interested in the IWW, I co-edited a book that I'm very proud of called Wobblies of the World, A Global History of the IWW. And that's an anthology, Chris. So that, you know, in case you don't know, that means that there's many different authors of different chapters. And that book I'm very proud of because there's nothing like it, right? But there's chapters on Australia and New Zealand and South Africa and Mexico and Canada and Sweden and Ireland and more, right? Because too much history is within the confines of national histories, right? The nation state is the dominant political form of the last few hundred years. But socialists believe aren't nationalists. Actually, some socialists are nationalists, but we call those people Nazis, right? And so, like, you know, literally, that's what the Nazis is, the National Socialist Party, right? Like, and so, you know, for internationalists like the IWW, we need to be thinking about crossing borders and sort of breaking down borders, right? Like, and so what might also be called transnationalism, right? Or even translocalism. And so I'm really interested, Chris, in sort of these sorts of connections, including, for example, the connections between IWWs in South Africa, the UK, and the US, right? Like, and those are the sorts of things, those are harder projects. They often also require multiple language skills as well as the ability to travel. Our anthology is so great because we have people from many countries who wrote chapters, and so I didn't have to travel to all these places, right? Like, as for what next, I do think that there needs to be more work, but I do in particular highlight the sort of internationalism, right, and these sorts of cross-border connections, right? I think the last thing I'll say, Chris, is that the IWW actually had a lot of power in Ohio and Cleveland, especially for many decades, as those in the IWW know, in the mid-20th century, and that's sort of unusual for a number of reasons. But I think that's history is very interesting. And then I said the last thing, but this is the actual last thing, right? You know, I showed a poster of the IWW and being anti-Klan. That's such an amazing poster, and people ask me about it. And I know very little about that. I don't know anything about creating the poster, although I tried very hard last year to find the origins of this poster, failed, right? But we know that the IWW and the Klan literally fought with each other in Maine, in Southern California, in various parts of the country. And that sort of 1920s stuff after World War I is also very much less known compared to its sort of pre-war and wartime. And so I encourage you, Chris, to sort of start to do some of this research too, so that we can get this stuff out there.
Yeah, another excellent question. There's a couple in the chat I'll read in a moment. On that topic, though, I do want to share briefly that if we could post this on the Freedom School Facebook page, but I think if you just do a YouTube search of People's History of Utica, you'll see a talk that I gave at Mohawk Valley Community College, but also gave at the Freedom School a couple years ago on local, people's history, focusing on the IWW, socialists, anarchists, etc. And stay tuned because there's a plan to have like a radical history walking tour in Utica to visit the sites, you know, IWW, Communist Party, anarchists, and other, you know, Italian, mostly Italian, but not exclusively radical sites. There is another question, and this is an excellent one from Liam. And Liam asks, what lessons does Ben Fletcher's life give us for organizing today?
Well, thank you, Liam, for that. So this is my opinion, right? Different people might draw different conclusions. But you know, when I think of Phil Fletcher and the union, he was a leader of Local 8 in Philadelphia. I think of, what do we have? A multiracial, multi-ethnic union that is able to hold power through really sort of working class power, right? Rank and file power. Leaders in the IWW, they rotated by rule. So like Fletcher wasn't always in charge because they only allowed people to be in charge for a year before you had to rotate back into the ranks. And so there were other leaders too, but you know, like what we need now, multiracial, multi-ethnic unionism, right? Like, so in my opinion, so unions now are at a lower percentage of America's workforce than since the 1920s, especially outside of the public sector is maybe a third of American workers, but the private sector, right, is, you know, 6 or 8% are union, right? Like, which is to say almost none, right? And we have to go back to the before the 1930s to find that, right? Like, so we also have in sort of the last 50 years seen a massive increase in economic inequality. You could draw a line like this, right, which is the decline of unions and the increase of economic inequality in the United States and in industrial country after industrial country around the world, right? Like, and so my opinion is that if you think that some people have way too much and most people don't have enough, the single best way to actually change that financially, even within capitalism, is unions, right? That has been historically proven. And it's been historically proven that without unions, we have increased inequality, right? Like, and so now add into this, we live in a country and a world, it's very diverse, right? Like where white supremacy, where xenophobia, as well as other forms of hate, like homophobia, sexism, only weaken us, right? Who benefits from this, right? Like, in my opinion, it's those with power, right? Like, and so, you know, we in 2021 have yet to live up to what the IWW in Philadelphia was doing 110 years ago, right? Many unions, I am sorry to say, right, in the United States continue to sort of harbor racist, xenophobic, and other negative tendencies. Even though I think unions are better than they were, say, 20 or 30 years ago on these matters, they still could do much better, right? Like, and so as far as what are the lessons, some of them are forget about the sort of the revolution, right? It's just about how do we make more people have less poverty, right? Which is to say, how do we basically get some of Jeff Bezos' money, right? And redistribute it downward, right? So when Martin Luther King calls unions the first anti-poverty program, right? Well, Martin Luther King, unlike Ben Fletcher, remains famous after being dead, right? Like, and so listen to King, right? And so I think unionism, but especially anti-racist, anti-xenophobic unionism, that in a way is the most basic yet actually most important lesson, I believe, that Ben Fletcher and Local 8 have to offer us.
Great question. Thanks for that. Who else? Does anyone else have a burning question they'd like to know about Ben Fletcher? Go right ahead.
Oh, good. My mic's on?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. So I imagine researching a book like this involves a lot of rabbit holes and tangents. What is your favorite little story or little negative information that you may not have been able to fit into the book or into your presentation?
So thank you for your question, Thomas. Like, so for those of us who engage in historical research, some of whom are paid to do it, and many of us are not, right? Like, I mean, there's lots of amateur historians, right? Like, and that can be very enjoyable. It also can be very frustrating, right? Because you can't sort of get stuff, right? Or you hope to find stuff and you can't. Now, in the case of the IWW, radicals generally, and working class people generally, and Black people and women, non-elite people and discriminated people generally have less documents documenting their lives, right? Like, and so anyone who studies these sorts of groups has to be mindful that that's the nature of this game, right? Like it's easy to study Woodrow Wilson. It's hard to study people who lived during Woodrow Wilson's presidency, right? Like, and in the case of the IWW, the federal government confiscated unknown quantities, but we're talking about in the thousands of pounds, right? Tons of evidence for these trials, plural. And then actually no one knows what happened to those records after these trials, but most people believe that the government destroyed these records in the 1920s, which makes sense. And I should also note that it's only in the 1930s that the National Archives is even created, right? Like, and so not to give the federal government a pass, right? Like, but they weren't keeping lots of records, not just these records. But, you know, Thomas, this is a long version of, and it's getting longer, right? Like, so, you know, when I was a grad student, I didn't have much money, like most grad students. And so I took a train, Amtrak, to Detroit from Washington, D.C., where I was a grad student. Of course, Amtrak being Amtrak, which is to say that underfunded public resource, right? Like I took a train to like Toledo, Ohio, and then got an Amtrak bus from Toledo to Detroit, right? Like, and then like walked to the Wayne State University because it has what's called the Reuther Archives, named after Walter Reuther, the legendary second president of the UAW. And the UAW was good enough to sort of throw a lot of money to Detroit's great public university, Wayne State, in order to build this labor archive, right? Like, and so I ended up spending some weeks in Detroit in the mid 90s. This is well before people were moving to Detroit. You know, there was no gentrification in Detroit in the 90s, right? Like, and so I was like, okay, how do I do this cheap? And so I was talking by email, which was new at that time, right? Like to an administrator there, and I'm like, I want to do this cheap. How can I do this, right? And they're like, well, you can stay at these hotels. I'm like, hotels are already too expensive, right? Like this is before couch surfing was online, right? Like, and so they're like, okay, I happen to volunteer with my church at this old age home. And so I'll see if there's some empty rooms, right? Like, and sure enough, someone died. And so suddenly there was a space available. So I was staying in a recently deceased person's room at this white Catholic old age home in Detroit, which was surrounded by barbed wire because the neighborhood had transitioned to being predominantly Black decades prior, right? And every morning, this woman, this very kind woman who didn't know me from Adam, picked me up, drove me to the library. I would do research, right? And then she would drive me back to this compound where I would spend time, and no one was hung out at night because everyone had TVs in their room. And because I was staying in a dead person's room, I didn't have a TV, right? Like, and so basically I did nothing at night, right? Like, but I spent all this time sort of in this old age home in Detroit in the mid 90s, right? And then, because I'm a vegan, right? I said, where am I eating? And this woman said, this very kind woman at Wayne State's Reuther Archives going, well, Cesar used to eat at this place. And so Cesar Chavez had also donated his papers to Reuther. And so there was this, you know, punk rock veggie restaurant in downtown Detroit near the university that I took all my lunches, because if Cesar Chavez eats there, I want to eat there too, right? Like, so I don't know if that's actually a story about thing that I found or didn't found, but it's sort of the first story that comes to mind about doing research that I enjoy sharing. It's probably been a few years, but archival research is cool because you have to go places. I mean, now with the internet, right, we have so much at our fingertips, which is wonderful, right? But actually, there's all sorts of things that, surprise, surprise, aren't online. And so you have to go to places, and it's hit or miss. Of course, there's other ways to do research like interviews, right? But, you know, doing archival research can be all sorts of wacky sort of outcomes. And it's also where the IWW deposited its papers, what it had in the 80s, I think, to the Reuther. I did see someone post a link to a KKK poster that I had shared. Thank you, Elizabeth, for doing that. I've been in communication with the archivist at the Reuther, as well as this wonderful library at University of Michigan called the Labadie Collection, which is a large collection of anarchist and other radical materials. They don't know where it came from. So they both have a copy of this poster, which is great, as well as a digital version. But no one yet knows, to my knowledge, where we got that poster from. Right, and I've even, like, there's a union bug actually on some of these, So it's printed by a union shop, very likely in Chicago. And so I was talking with friends who do print typography history in Chicago, but sort of dead ends, right? Like, so it probably was created in Chicago, which was the IWW headquarters, right? So that makes sense. But it was also had a huge printing industry in Chicago. There's something called Printers Row, right? Like, and so if anyone ever finds out more about that poster, please share. But unfortunately, the Ruther knows less than I know, right? Like, even though they do possess a rare actual copy, which I've never seen, but they were happy to share. And the Labadee, again, in Ann Arbor, is a wonderful place to do research, whether you're Thomas or someone else who just wants to sort of dig into sort of these old records.
Yeah, thanks for that. Who else has a question? Feel free to shout it out or send it in the group chat. Great. So Gabby Bray, who also mentioned in the group chat that they are Wayne State Library's employee. So, all right, Wayne State Library is in the house. So Gabby asks, could you briefly go into the organization structure of Local 8? What we know about what their meetings were like, how they functioned, etc.
So that's a great question. Thank you for that, Gabby. And I do love Wayne State University. I'm friends with people who teach in the Department of History and other places. So we don't know much, right? Like, there's so much that is unknown. I wrote a damn book, and I could create another book with just the questions I have that I don't have answers to, right? Like, thankfully, there's some internal records that come from other sources, so that are also in my book. So, for example, A. Philip Randolph and a man named Chandler Owen, sort of African-American socialist in Harlem, who co-published a magazine called The Messenger in the late teens and early 20s, that billed itself as sort of the only revolutionary socialist magazine, Negro socialist monthly, right? So they showed up at a meeting in 1921, and it's such a fascinating time. So this is the 100th anniversary coming up of the Tulsa Race Massacre, which is now sort of well known, even though it's not nearly as well known as it should be, right? So that was Memorial Day weekend, 1921. According to A. Philip Randolph and Chandler Owen's reporting on Local 8, there was a forum held about what happened in Tulsa. So this would have been the summer of 1921, right? Like, and in this meeting, they report about how basically both Black and white members of Local 8 castigated sort of the events that occurred there, but very much saw it as a way to divide working class people, right? And so through their lens, at this sort of discussion or forum that was happening at their hall, they were seeing the world through this notion that we cannot be divided. They were mindful, in other words, that racism was very real, that many white people bought into it and would kill Black people. In the case of Tulsa, it was because a Black man had bumped into a white woman on an elevator, and 300 Black people were killed, right? Like, we also know from that hearing, or I should say from that report covered in my book, that people drink a lot, right? And so there's more than one mention of John Barleycorn, right? Like the songs go, John Barleycorn is still around, right? But also that there were Garveyites in that conversation. Garveyites, supporters of Marcus Garvey, right? Who we would call Black nationalists. Not so different than later the Nation of Islam, right? That were sort of considered separatists. Racism was so bad that Black people would never get a fair shake in America, and therefore should form Black-only organizations and ultimately go back to Africa, right? Like, so we also see from this reporting about this meeting that Black and white members of Local 8 rejected the idea that there should be sort of segregated locals, whether it comes from Black people who want to sort of form their own union, or you might say caucus, right? Or from white workers, right? As for how else the organization ran, we know there were annual elections, that they mandated that they would be racially distributed. And so, for instance, I don't know, I'm just making up the terms, president would be Black, but vice president would be white, and vice versa. This was sometimes nicknamed checkerboard, right? And we also know that They mandated that elections be annual so that there would not be any distance between the elected leaders and the members, and that there were strict term limits. Depending on the union, 1 or 2 years, you had to go back into the ranks. And lastly, we also know that IWW leaders never could be paid more than anyone who worked in the field, right? And so they wanted to sort of eliminate the danger which happens in some unions where there's elected leaders are rich and members of the unions actually might be poor, right? And that those so-called leaders might forget really who they represent. And so a fierce horizontal leveling, frequent elections, so a believer really in sort of rank and file power, and generally a suspicion of centralization, which is also in keeping with the IWW's anarchist leanings. Hopefully, Gabby, that was an okay answer, and thanks again for being a Wayne State librarian, which is awesome.
Yeah, I just want to echo that again. Wayne State, the archives, the library there is just such an incredible resource. And if folks do have the opportunity, definitely check it out. Are there any other questions? I had one question. So if anyone is still thinking of one, feel free. But yeah, so Peter, my question is just more about Hubert Harrison. So another Black Wobbly radical, based in Harlem and in New York City. Could you say a little more about like who he was and what connections or lack thereof existed between both Hubert Harrison and Ben Fletcher? And then just finally, I mean, I know you mentioned this already about Ben Fletcher, and I'm gonna leave it there. So I think that's good.
So Hubert Harrison is not someone I'm an expert on by any means, but so he was a Black man who was originally from the Caribbean, maybe the Danish West Indies, right? Who moved to New York City, right? He's a young man and was clearly very intelligent and was very well educated, very much a sort of a thinker and a writer, as well as a speaker. Fletcher really wasn't a theoretician. He didn't write lengthy tracts, period, right? I wish he did, because then I would know maybe more about what he thought. By contrast, Harrison was voluminous in his writing, right? Which is a benefit to those of us who aren't around from his time, right? So we can learn much more. In fact, a wonderful radical historian named Jeff Perry in New York City, who's a retired postal worker, has long written about and has just published a sort of like 1,000-page book, right, about Hubert Harrison. Perry likes to describe Harrison as sort of like the most left-wing Garveyite, right, and the most race-conscious sort of socialist. I'm not into sort of the most and the best, but like, Harrison was clearly like a socialist. Garvey wasn't. Garvey was very much a Black capitalist, right? Like he's promoting Black businesses, right? And so there is this tension, I would say, between Harrison's view, which is anti-capitalist, but from the organization. And for a while, he was the editor of the Garvey newspaper, The Negro World, which was being read by hundreds of thousands of people, right? Like, and so Harrison is this really successful writer and editor, right? Around 1920, right? And he'll also die young and buried in New York City. But he also, though, so I would say the one thing I can say is that Fletcher is less of a race man, which was a term used for people who put race first. Fletcher did not, right? And so whether we critique him or not, and who are we and who am I, right, as a white man, but like Harrison was more race conscious, he would say, as were generally Garveyites. Fletcher, I wouldn't say downplayed race. And again, I assume that he wasn't only threatened with attacks once, but multiple times, right? And so he suffered from being Black in a white supremacist country, right? But Harrison thought much more about race, and Fletcher was more of a sort of a, I don't want to say class reductionist, I think that is incorrect, but at the same time, talked less about race, although he sometimes talked about race, right? Like, and more just about how all working people needed to come together because their major enemy was capitalism, as opposed to racism. Yeah, not that it's either or, it's never either or, and I hate the sort of the binary, right? Like, but Harrison was a bit more, as were Garveyites, of a sort of more race first. Yeah. Now, another related matter is, did they know each other? Were they friends? They must have known of each other. I have no proof that they knew each other. And Perry, in his voluminous books, makes no mention of Fletcher, right? And so from both ends, you might say, the person, me, who happens to know more about Fletcher, and the person who knows more about Harrison, there's no evidence on either side that they in fact were buddies, which is shocking in a way and unfortunate, right? They must have known of each other, right? But they might not have ever met, which is unfortunate in my opinion, but nevertheless, very possibly. The last thing I'll say about that, Brendan, is like, it's in my book, or books, plural, but so Claude McKay, another sort of legendary Black resident of Harlem, a Jamaican by birth, but who was a writer and a left-wing radical, a wobbly, then a communist, he writes in his novel Home to Harlem, there's a vignette in the book where it's clearly, he's referencing Local 8 and Ben Fletcher. He does not name them, but he describes how Philadelphia's waterfront workforce was integrated, but he does so in the context of criticizing the New York City waterfront union for being racist, which was historically accurate, which is to say that McKay knew about what was going on in Philadelphia. Unfortunately, I have no proof that McKay and Fletcher knew each other firsthand, even though McKay knew of Fletcher, and I presume that Fletcher knew of McKay, right? And so I try to be very careful, although it would be easy to sort of make assumptions about who Fletcher knew. He knew everybody, right? But unfortunately, we can't prove, right, that Fletcher was sort of hobnobbing, if you will, with these prominent Black radicals. But we do know that he was, A. Philip Randolph and Chandler Owen were very much in his sort of milieu, right? So, unfortunately, Harrison-Fletcher connection, it's tantalizing, it's sort of obvious for those who know the stuff and logical that they knew each other, but I personally can't say with certainty, and so I balk, right? I hesitate. But I do encourage everyone to learn more about Hubert Harrison because he was a fascinating figure, and you can read all sorts of things by and about Harrison.
Thank you. And so we probably have time for one more question. If there's a last burning question or comment anyone would like to make, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could maybe expand on the joys and struggles that you faced writing this second edition. Maybe besides, getting Robin Kelly to do the preface for you.
Well, thank you for that. So when the publisher of PM Press approached me and said, how about doing a second edition, I was blown away because rarely do niche, which is to say obscure, small printed runs of books get a second life, right? Fortunately, that occurred in 2019, and then in 2020, sort of did the work and it's just released. It's a joy that it's just out. It's twice as long because in the last 15 years, two things have happened. One, the world has changed, right? I say that there's a lot more people in 2021 who are thinking about racial capitalism than in 2006. There's a lot more interest in my book, right? Which makes me happy, but I think it's because I didn't do anything different necessarily. I think actually there's just more people thinking about these matters, right? Which I think is necessary and good. As for joys, right, so people found me. One example, the best example, is a man named Anatol Dolgov, who's featured near the end of his book, along with his parents, Esther and Sam. So Anatol Dolgov was, still alive. He's around 80 years old. He lives in New York City, where he was born and raised. And his parents were legendary Jewish anarchists in the early 20th century, and then lived a long time, and his father became a wobbly. And in the 30s and 40s in New York City, Anatol's parents became good friends with Ben Fletcher and his wife. So they hung out a lot. And so Anatol Dolgov knew Ben Fletcher when Anatol was a child in the mid and late 1940s in Brooklyn and in Manhattan. And a number of the documents late in my book are recollections of people who knew Fletcher, including Anatol's parents, as well as from Anatol himself. And Anatol wrote this wonderful book called Left of the Left that I encourage people to read. And so it's because my first book came out while we was on the waterfront and the original edition of Ben Fletcher that Anatol found me. I didn't know he existed. I didn't really know much about his parents, which was a mistake on my part, but nevertheless. And so that one of the joys has been getting to know Anatol Dolgov in the last dozen years, because he's the last, to my knowledge, living memory of Ben Fletcher. Because when Anatol was, say, 8, 9 years old, he hung out with Ben Fletcher. And for me, who's passed away, Ben Fletcher, decades and decades before I was born, this is as close as I can get, right? And although that's the best story, multiple other people sort of found me and my work over the last decade. That subsequently the second edition is much better, in part because people shared resources that they had collected, found, knew about with me. The last thing I'll say, Riley, and to everyone is that, like, I'm still finding stuff after the book was published. And so I'll just give you one example. So frustrating to me and embarrassing, but nevertheless. So in 1912, the year before Local 8 was founded, Fletcher was already a wobbly and already active in the Union. He traveled to the National Convention in Chicago in 1912, right? Like, just found this Camden newspaper. Camden's right across the Delaware River from Philadelphia. So it's basically a suburb, you could say, right? And this is before bridges, right? And so there was actually, you'd have to take a ferry back and forth from Philly to Camden, right? And so Fletcher was part of a musical group in Camden that was called The Corporation. What Fletcher sang or played instrument-wise, not named. It's only like a 4-sentence story in this little Camden newspaper, right? It's the first mention of his musical life, right? Because as little as I know about his public life, I knew even less about his private life. I suppose he was very funny. He smoked cigars, right? Like, after that, it starts to get thin, right? Like, so now I know he actually had some interest in singing, right? And maybe other forms of musicianship. Well, he was a great speaker by all accounts, and so that fits. Not in the book. It's not a big deal. It doesn't change in a way anything about his politics, right? But it's really interesting, right? Like, and I'm sure there's more stuff out there, right? I've also found 1 or 2 other documents or that people have shared with me, and it's like, oh, I can't believe. And so that in a way goes back to that earlier question, sort of about pain, right? Like, once something's published, it's published, and there's not going to be a 3rd edition, right? Like, and so, like, it is what it is. And so that's why I used to say this is everything about Ben Fletcher, and now I say it's nearly everything about Ben Fletcher. I'm certain that there's more material out there that will be found. I can only hope those people who find it will share it with me so that at least I know about it. And maybe at some future point, I'm able to donate it all to the Ruther. Yeah.
All right, thanks. So we have one more question from someone that came in a little later. This is from Johnny. So Johnny asks, so is there any archival evidence of correspondence or some kind of relationship or connection or conversation with Black feminist thinkers, writers, or radicals? Ida B. Wells, Lucy Parsons, just some examples, or anyone else?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. I'm no expert, right? Although I actually live part-time in Chicago. And so Lucy Parsons and Ida B. Wells, and I'm friends with a woman who's a great granddaughter of Ida B. Wells, just published a new book called Ida B. the Queen. The author's name is Michelle Duster. And she's very active online. But Ida B. Wells has become famous over the last handful of years, which is much deserved. Ida B. Wells lived in Chicago after she fled Memphis. After writing about her friends being lynched, she was threatened with lynching, and she lived for her final 40 plus years in Chicago, in a neighborhood that I've gotten to know very well, because it's also where Bronzeville is the neighborhood's name, where the Chicago race riot was centered. And I actually am a part of a public history project to sort of create public art to commemorate the 38 people killed in 1919, the summer. Ida B. Wells wrote about that. I don't know if Lucy Parsons wrote about that, although Lucy Parsons was this legendary wobbly figure, as you likely know, and buried, of course, with her late husband, Albert Parsons, in a cemetery just west of the city that everyone should visit if they have a chance, right? I wonder if Parsons and Wells knew each other. That's a really interesting, I have no knowledge of that. It makes sense, right? Parsons, of course, has a recent biography written about her by a historian. I'm blanking on her name. And Parsons lived in Chicago for decades, was at the founding convention of the IWW in 1905, gave some famous Labor Day speeches or May Day speeches in the 1930s in Chicago. And Wells was living into 1940 then as well. And so they were neighbors, right? They both were Black women living in Chicago. Did they hang out? Did they sort of, I have no idea, right? I'm actually gonna try to find an answer out. But to my knowledge, no. The last thing I'll say about Parsons, because I love her like many of us do. So in 1905, when she was at the founding convention, she invoked the first Soviet Russian Revolution, right? Like in 1905, there was a failed revolution in Russia, in St. Petersburg. And at the founding convention, she basically invokes that. So like that's 12 years before the second successful Russian Revolution occurred, right? But Parsons was an internationalist, right? And so she would have been, she wasn't the only internationalist by any means, right? In that crowd in Chicago, but she was one of them, right? And she also sort of, as many of us know, sort of remained fiercely committed to radical anarchism to her dying days, right? Some of us mellow, but it doesn't sound like she mellowed. And so, she's a wonderful woman, fascinating by. Barnett was much more well-known in her lifetime, deeply respected. And now in this neighborhood, well, I know where she lives. I've been to her house many times, 37th and MLK, right? The first housing project in Chicago that was open to Black people was named after her, the Ida B. Wells homes, right? On 37th, just south of King. And sort of, although it was torn down like many of these things now, it's an open field. There's now a marker actually for her on the corner where the Ida B. Wells homes used to be. And there's soon to be a major statue put up somewhere in that vicinity, in no small part because of Michelle Duster and her brother Dan, as well as others who have been working to sort of elevate her persona. And just 2 years ago in Chicago, a major street in the Loop was renamed. And so it's the first street named after a Black woman in the Loop in Chicago. Now it's called Wells Parkway. It used to be called Congress Parkway. It's an east-west road in the South Loop, right? And so we could use some more. There's actually efforts to get a Lucy Parsons Park and statue in Chicago, but Ida B. Wells at this point, I wouldn't say she's hit peak awareness, but like she's clearly elevated to a much higher point. If you could name another Black woman before modern times, you're probably unusual, right? Ida B. Wells might be number one, right? Although Chicago was full of amazing Black men and women in the 20th century. So anyway, that's just me speaking, which is to say I didn't have an answer. And so then I just spoke about different things related to these two women who I also appreciate as you do, Johnny. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Johnny. Good question. So I just want to thank you yet again, and I'm going to give this another try. So I just asked everyone to kindly unmute so we could just give everyone a moment to unmute so we could all collectively, as the Wobblies would and still do, right? Give Peter a warm round of applause and thank him for spending the night with us and teaching us a lot of great stuff about Ben Fletcher and the Wobblies. So thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Brendan, and thanks to those of you in upstate New York who have sort of been with us, and of course, anywhere in the world that you are right now. It's awesome. I appreciate the attention and the opportunity to talk about Ben Fletcher in the Union. He was a leader. Have a great night.
Thank you so much, Peter. And just for everyone else, like I said earlier, we did record this. So if you came late, we'll be working with some folks to get this posted online and get some past events posted online. And just want to plug yet again for folks in the Utica area, the Treehouse Reading and Art Center. So that's the Treehouse Reading and Art Center, has copies of Peter's book for sale. If you live somewhere else, want to get it online, you could go to PM Press, that's pmpress.org. And we'll be posting some information related to this talk and related to the IWW on social media. Just look up the Mohawk Valley Freedom School. Finally, as Peter knows, and I hope everyone here would agree, this is not just an event entirely of historical interests, you know, the struggle that Ben Fletcher and other Wobblies and other radicals back then is, you know, were involved in is one that many of us come out of. So this is to end the evening, you know, with, I guess, a way to encourage folks who are not yet actively engaged to find an activist group locally, get involved with them, reach out to the IWW, which is still in existence and we're still organizing, reach out to them. You can find them on iww.org and keep on the struggle. So thank you everyone for coming tonight.
Thank you.